December 24th, 1944, 04:15 a.m., near the village of Foy, Belgium. The air didn't just feel cold, it felt heavy, a physical weight pressing against the lungs of Major Friedrich von Scholz. He stood perfectly still, his boots sinking into a foot of fresh, crystalline powder that muffled the world into a haunting silence. To his left, the skeletal remains of a Panther tank hissed, its engine cooling into a metal corpse. Around him, the men of the 2nd Panzer Division were shadows, gaunt, gray figures wrapped in tattered overcoats, their breath blooming in the moonlight like ghosts escaping their bodies. Friedrich adjusted the collar of his M43 field blouse. Underneath the wool, his skin was paper dry. He hadn't eaten anything substantial in 48 hours. The bread issued to his men yesterday had been a gritty, gray brick, stretched with sawdust and potato peelings. It sat in his stomach like a lead weight, offering no warmth, only a dull, aching reminder of the Reich's collapsing logistics. "Major," a voice whispered. It was Lieutenant Hans Becker, a boy of 19 who looked 60. He was clutching a Carabiner 98K with frozen fingers. "The Americans, they aren't retreating anymore." Friedrich looked toward the tree line. For 3 days, they had pushed through the Ardennes, fueled by the desperate hope of the Walk am Rhein, the Great Offensive. They were told the Americans were soft, decadent, and broken. They were told the Amis would flee at the first sight of a Tiger tank. But as the sun began to peak over the jagged horizon, a low, rhythmic thrumming began to vibrate through the frozen ground. It wasn't the sound of German engines. It was the roar of the Allied war machine waking up. Suddenly, the sky screamed. A volley of American 105mm artillery shells tore through the canopy, turning ancient oaks into lethal splinters. Friedrich dove into a shallow slit trench, his face pressed into the freezing mud. He smelled cordite, burned oil, and the metallic tang of blood. Through the chaos, he saw a sight that felt like a hallucination. A group of American GIs in the distance, retreating from an outpost, but leaving behind a discarded crate. As the smoke cleared for a fleeting second, Friedrich's eyes locked onto the contents spilling out. It wasn't ammunition. It wasn't spare parts. It was white bread, pure, bleached, fluffy white bread, and next to it, a tin of colorful candies. Friedrich felt a cold spike of dread that had nothing to do with the winter. He looked at his own men, scavenging for a single cigarette butt or a handful of roasted acorns. The propaganda back in Berlin spoke of total war and the inevitable triumph of the German will. But as the American counterattack intensified, the major realized they weren't just fighting soldiers. They were fighting an industrial titan that could afford to give its frontline infantry luxuries his generals hadn't seen in years. By midday, the ghost of the Ardennes was fading. The German fuel tanks were dry, the shells were spent, and as Friedrich held the cold muzzle of an M1 Garand press against the back of his neck, he realized his war was over. But his education in the true scale of his defeat was only just beginning.
December 26th, 1944, 11:30 a.m., a muddy crossroads near Bastogne, Belgium. The transition from hunter to hunted was instantaneous and jarring. Major Friedrich von Scholz now stood in a shivering line of nearly 50 German officers and NCOs, their hands clasped behind their heads. The master race was now a collection of shivering, hollowed-out men in filth-caked field gray. Standing over them were GIs from the 101st Airborne, men who, by all rights of German military logic, should have been crushed days ago. Instead, these Americans looked annoyed more than defeated, leaning on their rifles and chewing gum with a casual, rhythmic indifference that infuriated Friedrich. "Move it, Fritz. We haven't got all day," a sergeant barked, gesturing toward a line of idling GMC CCKW 2.5-ton trucks, the deuce and a half. As Friedrich was shoved toward the back of a truck, he noticed something that made his eyes widen. The truck wasn't empty. It was filled with crates of oranges, fresh, bright, citrus-smelling oranges in the middle of a frozen hellscape. He watched as a young American private peeled one, the zest spraying a fragrant mist into the freezing air before tossing the fruit casually to a comrade. To the Germans, who hadn't seen a piece of fruit since the occupation of France in 1940, it was a display of wealth more intimidating than a Tiger tank. The truck convoy lurched forward, beginning the long journey toward the rear lines in France. Friedrich sat huddled against Lieutenant Becker, who was staring out the back of the canvas-covered bed. "Major," Becker whispered, his voice cracking, "look at the road." Friedrich shifted his position to see past the tailgate. For kilometers, the road heading toward the front was a solid, unbroken ribbon of olive drab steel. It wasn't just a convoy, it was a flood. Hundreds of trucks, jeeps, and tank retrievers flowed toward the Ardennes. They weren't struggling through the mud, they were conquering it with sheer mechanical volume. But it wasn't the numbers that broke Friedrich's spirit, it was the specialization. He saw trucks dedicated entirely to mobile laundry units. He saw specialized water buffalo trailers providing clean, filtered water. He saw field kitchens that looked like silver cathedrals of stainless steel. In the German army, a single horse-drawn wagon often carried everything from ammo to the unit's last sacks of rye. Here, the Americans had a different machine for every human need. As they crossed the border into France, the scale shifted from impressive to impossible. They passed a temporary airfield where P-47 Thunderbolts sat in neat rows, their bellies being fed by fuel tankers that seemed to have no end. "They told us the Luftwaffe would sweep the skies," Becker muttered, looking at the clouds where no German wings appeared. "The Luftwaffe is a memory, Hans," Friedrich replied quietly. "We are fighting a continent, not an army." The truck slowed as they approached a massive transit hub near Reims. The officers were offloaded near a series of massive prefabricated warehouses. Friedrich stepped off the truck and stopped dead in his tracks. Ahead of him rose skyscrapers of wooden crates, stacked 10 stories high, stretching as far as the eye could see. It was a city of supplies, built in weeks, designed to feed 1,000,000 men. And the smell of roasting coffee and sugar, was enough to make the starving German officers weep.
December 27th, 1944, 2 p.m. A rear echelon supply depot near Reims, France. Major Friedrich von Scholz stood paralyzed on the gravel of the depot yard. He had spent the last 4 years hearing Joseph Goebbels describe the Americans as a mongrel race capable only of producing jazz music and cheap Hollywood films. But as he looked up, the sun caught the stencilings on thousands of towering wooden crates, creating a skyline of commerce and calorie that defied military logic. This is a mistake," Lieutenant Becker whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of hunger and horror. "This must be the entire supply for the whole Western Front, all of it, gathered in one spot." Friedrich shook his head slowly. He watched as a fleet of forklifts, machines he had rarely seen in the Wehrmacht, where human backs and literal horsepower did the lifting, scurried like mechanical ants. They were moving crates with a frantic, bored efficiency. He read the markings: chocolate bars, vitaminized; coffee, soluble; turkey, boneless. The smell was an assault. In the German trenches, the scent of war was wet wool, rotting feet, and the metallic tang of ersatz coffee made from roasted acorns. Here, the air was thick with the rich, oily aroma of genuine cocoa and the sweet, cloying scent of canned peaches. An American quartermaster officer, a captain with a clipboard and a clean uniform that looked like it had been pressed an hour ago, walked past the line of prisoners. He wasn't even armed. He didn't need to be. He was shielded by the sheer mountain of logistics behind him. He paused, pulled a small rectangular bar from his pocket, unwrapped the silver foil, and took a bite of dark Hershey's chocolate. He tossed the wrapper onto the ground near Friedrich's boot. Friedrich looked down at the foil. It was high-quality paper and aluminum. In Germany, every scrap of foil, every tooth of a zipper, and every copper pipe was being melted down for the final victory. Here, it was trash. "Major," Becker said, pointing toward a secondary yard, "look at the specialized rations." Beyond the skyscrapers of standard C rations were stacks of K rations, 3 separate boxes for breakfast, dinner, and supper. Each contained not just food, but cigarettes, matches, chewing gum, and even toilet paper. Friedrich thought of his men back in the Ardennes, shivering in foxholes, sharing a single damp cigarette between 5 people, and using frozen leaves for hygiene. The realization hit him like a physical blow to the chest. The German high command had planned the Ardennes offensive down to the last liter of fuel they didn't even have, counting on capturing American depots to keep their tanks moving. They had gambled the entire Reich on the hope that the Americans were overextended. But as Friedrich watched a 10-ton crane effortlessly hoist a crate of refrigerated meat into a waiting truck, he understood the catastrophic error of the general staff. The Americans weren't overextended. They were overflowing. They weren't just bringing a spear to the fight. They had brought an entire factory, a grocery store, and a luxury hotel, and they had paved a road of steel to deliver it to the front lines. "Hans," Friedrich said, his voice hollow, "the maps in Berlin, they show lines and divisions. They show the will to win, but they don't show this." "Show what, Herr Major?" Friedrich gestured to a mountain of crates labeled fruitcake, holiday special. "The war is over, Hans. It was over before we even crossed the border. We are not fighting an army. We are fighting an assembly line that doesn't know how to stop." December 27, 1944, 4:45 p.m., a processing center inside the Reims Supply Depot. The sun was dipping low, casting long, skeletal shadows across the rows of crates. Friedrich and his fellow officers were led into a massive, heated hangar that smelled of floor wax and diesel exhaust. Inside, a group of American clerks sat behind folding tables, their typewriters clattering with a rhythmic industrial speed. The sound was a machine gun of bureaucracy, recording the names of the conquered with the same detached efficiency used to inventory crates of canned ham. Name, rank, serial number, an American sergeant asked, not looking up from his forms. Friedrich provided the information mechanically, but his eyes were fixed on a stack of newspapers sitting on the corner of the desk. It was the Stars and Stripes. On the front page was a photo of a Christmas dinner being served to American troops just miles from the front. They were eating turkey, actual roasted turkey, with cranberry sauce and mashed potatoes. Friedrich looked at his hands. They were stained with the oil of a broken Tiger tank and the dirt of a frozen trench. He thought of his commander, Model, and the frantic orders barked over crackling radios about holding the line at all costs. The cost was the lives of 18-year-olds who believed they were defending civilization. Yet here, in this heated hangar, the Americans were worrying about whether the gravy was hot enough. "Move along, Major," the sergeant said, sliding a small canvas bag toward him. Friedrich opened the bag. Inside was a capture kit. It contained a toothbrush, a bar of ivory soap, a razor, and, most devastatingly, a small pack of Camel cigarettes and a chocolate bar. He stepped back into the line, holding the chocolate as if it were a live grenade. Beside him, Lieutenant Becker was staring at his own bar of soap. The young man began to laugh, a dry hacking sound that bordered on hysteria. "Major," Becker choked out, "do you know what we were told in the officers' mess in Berlin? We were told the American economy was a house of cards, that their workers were on strike, that their ships were all at the bottom of the Atlantic." Friedrich peeled back the wrapper of the Hershey's bar. The chocolate was bark, smooth, and smelled of a world that no longer existed for Germany. He took a small bite. The sweetness was overwhelming, almost painful. It was the taste of a nation that could afford to give its prisoners of war better rations than the German High Command could give its elite paratroopers. "We were lied to, Hans," Friedrich said quietly, the sugar coating his tongue like a bitter realization. "Not just about the Jews or the Bolsheviks or the New Order. We were lied to about the scale of the world." He looked out the open hangar doors at the skyscrapers of supplies once more. In the distance, a massive C-47 transport plane roared overhead, its belly full of even more crates. It occurred to Friedrich then that if the German army managed to destroy one of these depots, the Americans would simply build 2 more by Tuesday. The logistical backbone of the Third Reich was a spindly thing of horse carts and stolen trucks. The American backbone was a conveyor belt that stretched across the Atlantic Ocean, powered by factories that never slept and a treasury that seemed bottomless. "They aren't just winning the war," Friedrich whispered, watching a forklift driver toss a pack of gum to a passing guard. "They've already forgotten we're even a threat. We are just a logistical hurdle to be cleared before they move on to the next shipment." December 27th, 1944, 07:30 p.m., a makeshift POW enclosure, outskirts of Reims. The evening air was biting, but for the first time in months, Friedrich wasn't shivering. The Americans had set up a row of pot-bellied stoves inside the large barbed wire perimeter. The orange glow flickered against the faces of hundreds of German officers who sat in a stunned communal silence. There was no talk of counterattacks. There was no talk of the Wunderwaffen, the miracle weapons that Hitler promised would turn the tide. Friedrich sat on an overturned wooden crate, his capture kit open on his lap. He watched Lieutenant Becker, who was staring intently at a small, circular tin of American shoe polish. "Major," Becker said, his voice barely a whisper, "I just saw a truck drive past the wire. It wasn't carrying shells. It wasn't carrying fuel." Friedrich looked up, his eyes weary. "What was it carrying, Hans?" "Ice cream," Becker replied, his voice cracking with a mix of awe and despair. "A refrigerated truck labeled Mobile Ice Cream Unit. They are bringing frozen sweets to the front lines while our horses are dying in the snow so we can eat their carcasses." Friedrich felt a hollow laugh bubble up in his throat. It was the final, absurd nail in the coffin of the Third Reich. The German military philosophy was built on blitzkrieg, lightning war, a sharp, violent burst of energy intended to knock an opponent out before resources became an issue. They had assumed the Americans were soft because they valued comfort. They had mistaken a high standard of living for a lack of martial spirit. But as he looked at the sheer volume of skyscrapers surrounding this transit hub, he realized the truth. The American soldier was the best equipped fighting man in history because his country viewed his life as an investment, not just a resource. In the academy, Friedrich mused, looking at the glowing tip of his Camel cigarette,
They taught us that the soldier's will is the supreme factor in war, that the Aryan spirit would overcome any material disadvantage. He exhaled a cloud of blue smoke. They forgot to tell us that the Aryan spirit can't fire back at a 155mm long tom battery that has an infinite supply of shells. He looked toward the horizon, where the distant flashes of artillery lit up the Belgian border. Somewhere out there, his old comrades were still huddled in the mud, clutching their Mausers, waiting for a supply drop that would never come, or a Tiger tank that had run out of petrol 5 kilometers ago. They were fighting for a ghost. A young American MP walked past the wire, whistling a tune Friedrich didn't recognize. The soldier looked well-fed, his skin healthy, his gear pristine. He caught Friedrich's gaze and gave a short, casual nod, not the stiff, ideological salute of a subordinate, but the acknowledgement of one human being to another. "Hans," Friedrich said, standing up and dusting the snow from his knees. "Go to sleep." "How can you sleep, Major? The world is ending." "No," Friedrich replied, looking one last time at the 10-story towers of rations that loomed like monuments in the moonlight. "The world isn't ending. Our world, the one built on the lie of our superiority, is dead. This is the future, and it's a future that can afford to give its enemies chocolate while it crushes them." He laid down on the folding cot the Americans had provided. As he closed his eyes, the rhythmic sound of a distant bulldozer clearing more land for more supplies acted as a funeral march for the 1,000-year Reich. The war wasn't going to end in a climactic duel of heroes. It was being swallowed whole by a mountain of canned peaches and a sea of Hershey bars. End.